So let's talk about starting an army of sadistic murdering space elves for some ideas for collecting Drukhari in current Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Drukhari, and this video doing a general overview of options to collect the faction in current Warhammer 40K. In this one, let's talk through some of the basics of the faction and why you might want to collect Drukhari in the first place, some ideas for planning out a collection, some first purchases and things to expand on, and finishing up with a few rules and one example army list. Lots to talk about for the spiky space elves, so let's jump straight in. First up, let's talk about why you might want to collect Drukhari in the first place, between their lore, rules and miniatures. In the lore and background, I feel like Drukhari might well be in the running for one of the very most evil and depraved factions of Warhammer 40k. They're essentially the twisted Eldar of old, partying so hard that prior to the fall they caused the god of Slanesh to be burst into existence, the god of excess and dark desires tearing out the heart of their realm, the craft world Eldar fleeing on their great spaceships, and then the Drukhari or Dark Eldar hiding within their twisted nightmare city of Comera within the webway. Since this time, the Drukhari society sustained itself by the use of the homunculi flesh crafting, growing themselves new bodies and transferring their souls to deny Slanesh their souls on death, and most of their entire society revolves around the pain and suffering of others, striking out in cruel raiding fleets to steal and enslave, feeding off the pain and souls of their captives, and carrying off both mighty warriors and civilian populations alike for unspeakably gruesome fates in the Dark City. When they make war, it's typically to raid, steal, or inflict pain. They classically fight from the backs of their skimmer transports, such as raiders and venoms, using advanced poison weapons, dart-like guns, and their extremely fast movement and agility to get the first strike with their attacks. In their battles and raids, also striving to maximise the suffering of their luckless foes. On these great raiding parties, they have distinct sub-factions within their society, the warring cartel-like Kabbalite warriors, generally being the main power brokers of the city, though they might be allied to the gladiatorial witch cults, excelling in putting the mortal races to entertaining deaths in the arenas, and then there's the twisted flesh creations of the homunculus covens, turning captives into Frankenstein monster-like creations to unleash upon the enemy. Miniatures-wise, they have a fairly well-developed range, being a faction that came in around the turn of the millennium, and then had a major big refresh around 2010. The updates since this time being fairly few and far between. Despite having some older kits in the range, I feel like they hold up really well to modern day aesthetics. The models tend to be slender, spiky and dangerous looking, maybe being a bit more of a pain to transport than certain 40k armies out there. Though in 10th edition they did have a rather unfortunate small contraction of their range. Several kits that have been staples since their inception being sent to Warhammer Legends and no longer on sale. That perhaps does mean there might be a more chance of getting some proper love and updates in the next edition of the game, hopefully. For a brief tour of some of their miniatures, perhaps their most standard base troop are the Kabbalite warriors, essentially space dark elves mainly aimed with poison weaponry. Their skimmer transports are some of the most iconic things the faction has to bring to bear. Here we have the small and nimble venom craft, and then there's a heavily armed ravager at the back there, mounting a bunch of dart-like weapons. It means that an army with a bunch of those transports can resemble a bit of a sailing fleet. Here are some of the witch cults, with the basic witches with their exotic weapons used for fighting in the arena, though no less deadly on the battlefield. Leo Hesprat's a character to lead them, and they also have the Hellions and Reaver jet bikes as subsets of their craft. The Reavers move at extreme speed, with precision for their blade veins to sever key arteries on their target units. Then here are some of the homunculus models. They have a character homunculus himself, and then smaller flesh creations with the Rax, and the larger ones with the Talos and Kronos pain engines, disturbing medical Frankenstein monster-like creations made from bits of other races. This section of the army is unfortunately rather small right now. Games Workshop no longer currently selling models for Grotesque or Urian Rakarth, though I guess they'll be back in the long term. Then beyond the major allegiances, they do have a bunch of helpers and hangers-on. Winged Scourges often providing some heavy fire support, Elite Guard Incubi or the Shadowy Mandrakes, and it means that you can have quite a widely varied raiding force with a bunch of different elements coming together, or go fairly far down one theme. I feel like the Incubi models are quite nice. They were redone in at least relatively recent history. Price-wise, the Drukhari are perhaps middling or upper middling in terms of cost to collect the army as 40k goes right now. Not exactly the priciest army in the game, but also not the cheapest either. Several of their units don't really cost all that many points to put on the board, which doesn't help them too much, but at the same time having a fair few older kits in the range actually does mean that they're a little cheaper than they would be if Games Workshop re-released them now. For example, if they redid the Hellions kit and came out with new models for them, I'm sure they'd cost significantly more than their current price. Admittedly, the change with their combat patrol didn't help them out too much. It went from being quite a nice general purpose one to quite focused on just one aspect of the army. Gameplay-wise, their rules in current Codex Drukhari generally have them as an aggressive and very fast-moving faction. Almost all of their army moves relatively fast compared with other races out there, that if they get hit first, besides a few of the Coven's things, small armies will tear them apart pretty quickly. So they're usually going to be an army that needs to play cagey, using terrain to good advantage and hiding from the foe, and trying to engage on first strikes or unfair fights wherever possible. As mentioned, relative to most armies, transports have unusual significance for that. They've got lots of very fragile infantry that wants to get close, so jumping into transports to keep them safe and get them close tends to be well worth the points. Their core ability is Power from Pain. It is fairly fun and thematic the way they generate the tokens. They get one each battle round, but then also generate more either when destroying enemy units or when they fail battle shock tests, so they do feed off the terror and get to plug it into their unit's abilities. In the Codex this was redone to be really quite complex. Each unit has a pain ability, and you can spend a pain token to activate it, so it's almost like you've got a vast amount of extra stratagems that you can call upon. Loads and loads of options and different ways to get things done, and as a result they maybe are a trickier army to play to their full potential at the moment. It feels like between their nature with fast moving and fragility, plus the pain token thing, they're likely to be an army that does great in the hands of people that really know them inside out, but potentially just a tiny bit more challenging for beginners to the faction. Post-Codex they do have quite a lot of detachments, most of them at least fairly playable. Currently their strongest seems to be the digital download Reaper's Wager for some nice support getting their troops in close and hitting hard when they get there, though the rest are usable enough. For current power levels post-Codex, it looks like they may be on the sort of lower mid-tier of Warhammer 40k armies, though realistically all the factions are pretty well balanced right now, so it's not the end of the world. Plus I wouldn't really pay too much attention to in-game power. By the time that you've embarked on collecting up an army and got one on the tabletop, there's a pretty good chance things might have changed several times since then. In any case, if you wanted to put a twisted and murderous force of Dark Elves in space on the tabletop, have some cool spiky models with some razor-fast assault craft, and some fast-moving first-strike hard-hitting tactics, the Drukhari might be for you. Before we move on to planning an army and first purchases, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Futureproof Modular Terrain, made by Snot Goblin Gaming, who sponsored the video. The idea behind their stuff is they make a modular terrain set, so they have a whole bunch of sculpted plastic pieces that could be assembled in a bunch of different ways, making different sizes and shapes of ruins, with a focus on it being fairly practical terrain for the 40k rules at the moment. Compared with most sets as well, they have the interesting option of getting it pre-coloured, so pre-painted before it turns up to you, and that is kind of rare for any terrain set that actually has some physically sculpted detail on it. Here's a few real-world examples of their stuff with my miniatures next to it. I thought the World War style one was kind of fun, with the sort of painted sandbag effect that they have going on. I quite liked the colours of the Shrine World one. Their main offering for the set is this full table set, usually around $240 or $300 painted. I believe that's using the Auspex secured discount code that I'll leave in the video description. In any case, check them out, links down in the video description below if you'd like to. They do have a vast amount of different colour schemes if you want to take a look over them. Thanks to them for sponsoring this one, and I'll cycle back to them briefly at the end of the video. Getting back to the spiky Eldar though, and if you do decide to choose Drukhari as a faction, there's plenty of ways that you could do a bit of research and planning into the army. I would likely pick up the recent Codex Drukhari at least relatively early into the process if you're new to the army. It's got plenty of lore and background of the faction, miniature galleries, and the in-game rules profiles. If wanting just to get a general understanding of it though, Warpedia and New Recruits both have third-party rule sources, and you could use them to mess around building some army lists if you wanted to see what might make up, say, a 1,000 point or 2,000 point army. And you could even get some games in before miniatures with things like Tabletop Simulator or proxy models to try them out. I've made a few Drukhari videos on the channel myself, including a Codex overview and a tier list video recently. The tier list might be helpful to some people for the roles and strengths of the different units, and I'll link that down in the video description. Elsewhere on YouTube there's plenty more though, battle reports, painting guides and all sorts of lore things. It can be quite fun just to learn about a faction from a bunch of different angles. If you wanted a dedicated Drukhari channel, then Archon Skari's Guardcast is pretty excellent, particularly for gameplay things from an expert level player. Otherwise, probably worth following along with the Drukhari various social media things out there, wherever you get it. Discord servers, Facebook pages and subreddits could all be handy enough, both as places to ask a few basic questions to experienced hobbyists, and also just to imbibe some of the talk conversations and cool painted models that you see other players making. When planning out an army, early in the process it might be worth planning out either an 1,000 point or 2,000 point army list, maybe using New Recruits or the Warhammer app. Generally when collecting Warhammer factions, the majority of people tend to build at least somewhat balanced, having some core units, some that are useful in gameplay, and some that you just really like the look and feel of. The balance between that's probably going to be quite personal, and really not the worst idea to fill things out for yourself. Then maybe if you're a bit more experienced, you could collect a bit more of a skew list of one sort or another. Perhaps having the primary focus of your force either being either the Cabals, Cults, or Homunculus Covens, with the other ones being more allied supporting things, maybe led by a charismatic Archon or Homunculus or something. And perhaps another major decision might be how prominent you want transports to be in the army. Do you want to go really heavy on them with basically having the option for everything to be mounted up, or have them be a bit more light touch? Usually having some but not loads is probably optimal at the moment, though you can go heavy or light. As a sort of related thing for all that and converting it into gameplay, you could collect towards one given detachment in the codex. They've got plenty of core themes available. Realspace Raiders as a fairly balanced raiding crew, Sky Splinter Assault with transport focused, one detachment each for the Homunculus Covens, the Cabalite Warriors and the Witches. Both the Cabals and the Witches ones are at least fairly strong. The Homunculi with their unit pool is just a bit lacking at the moment though, unfortunately. And then finally there's the one that isn't in the codex in the digital download called the Reaper's Wager. In theory that's allied Harlequin focused, but in reality it actually does a very good job of supporting just general Drukhari units, getting close to the enemy and hitting hard. Currently it's the most commonly played one in competitive play, and it's quite a lot of fun. If starting an army anew, I'd probably build at least fairly balanced. There's maybe just the danger that if you just collect religiously to the Spectacle of Spies and have witch cults as your only theme, you're probably going to be more susceptible to Games Workshop changing rules or army compositions compared with most armies. Otherwise, for things to plan in the early phases, you need to get a paint scheme down. I'd probably recommend a Cabalite Warrior as being the single most easy place to start with that one. It's fairly small and representative of the faction with some of their classic spiky armour, plus their weapons, flesh tones, and maybe a few accent things that you're likely to have on other units. And likely the best to start on something small to see whether or not you like the look of it, and whether you need to make any bigger changes before going for some higher investment characters or vehicles with it. If you did want to focus on cults or covens though, then maybe a witch or a rack could be the other options. The Drukhari do have quite a lot of ways to paint up their armour. Some going for more metallic tones or sort of plasticky type tones. Some going for the sort of almost black armour with some highlights around the edge of it, like this Cabal of the Black Heart. Compared with most though, they do feel like an army where people are quite likely just to make up their own colour schemes, as opposed to necessarily follow set ones. Known ones from the lore do exist though. Here are just a few of the Cabals, and the cults and covens might have their own schemes as well. If looking for inspiration, you could roughly go with your own interpretation of one of these, or perhaps have a look around on YouTube. There's generally quite a lot of painting tutorials, and one of the simplest ways to get going can just be to find one that you like and follow along with it. Getting into perhaps the most exciting bit with first miniatures though, there's a few different ways for starting an army, and currently if jumping into Drukhari, I'd probably either go with a box of Cabalite Warriors, maybe the Combat Patrol for Drukhari, though if possible I'd probably go with one of their previous discount sets if you can find them at an okay price. Their Realspace Raiders Battle Force box set still seems to be available in many parts around the world. The Combat Patrol box set for Drukhari was a bit of an unfortunate downgrade in my opinion. It's definitely still helpful, but nowhere near as general purpose as the previous one, and this one's basically a discount box set for the Homunculus Covens. You get a Homunculus to lead it, 2 sets of 5 rack, and then 2 Talos Pain engines that you can build as a Kronos Parasite engine if you want. Basically, if you wanted a Homunculus Covens element to your force, this adds it for you all in one big go. It does mean that it's just not very general purpose and relevant to the entirety of the army though, and the numbers for it are a bit mid compared with other combat patrols out there. The discount versus buying individually isn't as big as some of the others, only 23% off. Still enough to be useful, but a bit on the weak side as Games Workshop goes, and the points in the box are on the low side as well at 360 here. Again, it's not one of the best for the discount box sets. Maybe doesn't help too much that some of the units are just a bit mid in game at the moment. Both the Talos Pain engines and the Kronos Parasite engines are solid enough. The Rax and Homunculus are both usable, but not quite so standout or interesting that they seem to be making their way into the majority of top army lists, which maybe is saying something as the vast majority of Codex units do. If the plan is to collect a big Drukhari army with forces of Cabals, Covens and Cults though, I certainly would aim to get one of these at some point. It's just that it might not necessarily be the single first purchase to make, unlike many of the combat patrols for other factions out there. Before talking about other units and options to expand the army, I'll just mention options for buying Warhammer 40K miniatures in general. Direct from Games Workshop's Warhammer web store is often the most reliable way to get miniatures, and a few of the Drukhari miniatures are online only. But for the majority of units and combat patrols and things, most of the time it's going to make more sense to go via discount retailers, officially selling the same thing for less. There's quite a lot of examples of those around the world, and here are just a few of them that support the channel. There's Element Games in the UK for 15% off, Gap Games in Australia for 21% off, Fenris Workshop in Canada for 10%, Wargame Portal in the USA for 15%, and Taschengeldieb in Germany and the EU for 16% or so. They're all linked down in the video description. There's also a code down there for an extra 4% off Taschengeldieb. If you do happen to buy anything after clicking those in the video description, it does go to help support Auspex Tactics a bit, but there's plenty of other good discount retailers out there of course. Beyond new models, there's other options for saving as well though. eBay and the second-hand market can often be worth a look to save a fair bit. Quality can be a bit variable, and particularly with fragile Drukhari, there's maybe a bit more chance of damage if people haven't looked after their miniatures too well though. Still, it can be a way to save quite a lot of money versus new plastic kits. And also 3D printing and third-party manufacturers out there. In general, there's near equivalent proxies for just about every 40k unit out there in some way, shape or form, and can both be an option to economise for certain armies, or also just fun for getting some different aesthetic bits to customise an army. For maybe the other major option to kick off a collection at the moment as a discount set though, currently Drukhari still have Realspace Raiders out there in the wild. This was the launch box with their 10th edition codex, which hasn't been so very long ago at time of recording. And you basically just get a great big mix of the Drukhari infantry and elite kits in a big box at £150 or $240. That comes at least a fairly good discount compared with buying them separately. It also includes a Venom and the new Archon model as well. You certainly could get both this and the Combat Patrol, though if you had to choose one or the other, I'd prioritise Realspace Raiders versus the Homunculi myself. It just has quite a nice mix of lots of units that are very relevant in game at the moment, with literally every single unit here being top tier for the Drukhari currently, and also just quite a nice wide selection of units, so you've got lots of options for how you can play the faction. It's currently off sale from Games Workshop, though there's lots of third-party retailers that still have it in stock around the world. Each region I've checked do seem to have some people selling it either at full price or at small discounts. One option to pick it up at the moment looks like it's Firestorm Games in the UK, as will be linked below. It seems to have it at £132, so a small discount. Supplies of this one will gradually dry up though, so it might not be quite so relevant if you're watching this significantly after the release date of this video. Talking through some specific units and options to expand the army though, let's just go through a few choices that are pretty solid on the tabletop right now, so it might be of some interest if the models appeal. First up, I think it's generally a good idea to have some Cabalite warriors. They are pretty much the staple troops of the faction, so very likely to be relevant even if rules change around. Currently it's nice to have their sticky objective style rule, and there's multiple ways that you could use them, either damage dealers with Lady Malice in a raider potentially, or split into multiple small units with Venoms, have some of them use their sticky objectives rule on the home objective, and then the Venom take up the ones to the mid-board to do that there. They do have to get out there though, unlike the raider, though it's not the end of the world. Incubi are some solid dangerous elites for the faction. Nice attacks with reasonable strength and damage too. They take buffs well, such as Drukhari or lethal hits from any source. They can be quite a high value units to have jumping out of a raider or Venom. For transports, I absolutely would be tempted to get some. At the moment I generally see the default as the Venom more so than the raider. Nice for small units and splitting bigger ones of Cabalites and Witches. I'd be more tempted to use the Raider if you're going for any single big damage combos, say Lilith Hesperax and 10 Witches all in the same squad, or Archons or Drukhari leading Incubi or Cabalite Warriors. Provided there's some decent line of sight blocking terrain to hide behind, Scourges are really powerful as long range firepower that the opponent's not really going to be able to interact with, popping out, shooting and then hiding again. They're also at least a relatively cheap kit that gets you lots of points on the board, though I would bear in mind that you just get one of each of the weapons in the box, so if you wanted 4 Dart Lancers, one kit isn't going to directly represent that. For most casual games though, most people aren't going to care too much about slight variations in the fancy weapons that the Drukhari have. The majority won't really know the difference. Mandrakes are good to have some of as infiltrators. They're quite nice for the objective skirmishing game. Their codex datasheet has got more damage than it used to have, and their fade away trick is still super powerful for potentially doing secondaries or putting the hurt on isolated units later in the game. Reavers and Hellions are both strong units to skirmish with infantry, the Hellions having a decent bit of melee damage and moving fast, and then the Reavers just move ridiculously fast, potentially with the option to advance, shoot and charge in Reaper's Wager for a command point, which can be really big if they're charging something right in the heart of the enemy army and causing big disruption. Lilith Hesperax and a squad of Witches are relatively cheap for the whole unit. They're also very fast with their pain token to be able to advance and charge themselves, and Lilith makes the squad's damage general purpose enough that they can handle some tougher stuff, as well as just light infantry. Finally for characters, basically all of them are fairly solid. The Archon's got some alright stats and command point manipulation. Lady Malice is a melee powerhouse, buffs her squad and has 2 useful buff and debuff rules, and Drukhari just hits really hard with Incubi. You can certainly go fairly character heavy for Drukhari if you want to at the moment, and it's not too uncommon to see most of these 4 plus Lilith in a list. Between these ones that already covers a pretty big chunk of the Drukhari codex. As mentioned, I still consider most of the rest of it really quite playable, though some of these ones are perhaps some of the most central and scary options right now. Otherwise, for other options and things to mention collecting wise, there is the previous Combat Patrol Drukhari that you might stumble across occasionally. This one's got a Raider, Ravager, 10 Cabalite Warriors, some Incubi and the old style Archon. Even with the older Archon, I still rate this as far superior to the current Combat Patrol box set, just a bit more central units for the army. If you do manage to find this going for some semblance of a normal Combat Patrol price, then it's pretty well worth it. It's not going to be the sort of thing that you're likely to find online at reasonable cost though, maybe one that might turn up from time to time in discount retailer gaming stores. Then finally, for one thing to mention for expanding the army, it's probably just worth mentioning that there is an option to add in Harlequins and Corsair units from the Eldar codex if you'd like to. It could give you a bit more variety with the models that you field. The core Drukhari range has plenty to be getting on with, but it just might not be super obvious at first glance that you can add these guys in. Games Workshop just kind of briefly removed the ability to ally them in for most attachments, and then added it in via the Drukhari Faction Pack rules download from the Warhammer community website. In most attachments, it's not necessarily a great gameplay idea, and even in Reaper's Wager, where they do get some stratagem support and things, the Harlequins are still a bit on the weak side really. Maybe a lone solitaire being perhaps the single most common inclusion. Some managed to make some heavier use of Harlequins work in the Reaper's Wager though, and they could just be a fun option if you want some different flavour miniatures to act as allies, the Servants of the Laughing God helping out the Darkkin, as well as the Craft Worlds. In general though, if collecting Drukhari currently at time of recording, I would probably start with the Realspace Raider Battle Force if it's available, and then expand from there with a few transports, characters, and maybe some mandrakes and other units I mentioned from that list. In 40k though, there are multiple good ways to collect an army, and there's always a lot of scope for collecting what you like the look of. Rules and in-game power levels change over time, though typically until updates happen the models remain. It's perhaps worth mentioning that for game balance things, I would bear in mind that aircraft are unlikely to be super strong in 10th edition. Games Workshop does seem to be intent on keeping them more niche. Someone in the rules team just basically seems to have decided that they shouldn't really be competitive units for 40k, but more fringe things aimed at slightly more casual games. The Void Raven isn't completely unusable, but it's pretty overshadowed by other things in my opinion. In any case, for general collecting, I'd have a rough idea of a 2,000 point army list that you might be roughly working towards, and then build towards that, playing games and adapting as you go. Maybe getting enough miniatures together to have some small games to start with, but from there going fairly sustainably, painting up the miniatures that you do have and then move on to the next. For the future, there's at least some chance that Games Workshop might have a new release wave for Drukhari models in 11th edition 40k. I touched on it earlier, but Grotesques, the Court of the Archon, the Beastmaster and Beastbacks, and Urian Rakarth all got taken away and put into Warhammer Legends. That was a blow to people who already had them in their collections. They are units that have been around since the early days of Drukhari, though most of their fine cast models had flaws of various sorts, generally being very expensive to put together a unit of them. It does mean that rules for these plus a few Forge World goodies exist in the Drukhari faction pack though, and if your local playgroup is chilled about playing with Legends, there could be a few more options to convert some stuff for if you wanted to, though my suspicion is that at least for Grotesques and the Beastmaster and Urian Rakarth, they'll all be back at some point, maybe the Court of the Archon as well. Finally, let's touch on some rules and gameplay, and one example starter army list. As mentioned, the current army rules are from Codex Drukhari itself. If you buy the book, then you get a download code that you can put into Games Workshop's Warhammer app. It does have some value of its own, though if you don't find that as a particularly useful way to reference rules, you could just buy a codex second hand. Games Workshop's rules have a hybrid system at the moment, so you have the physical imprint book supported by a bunch of digital downloads online. These are found on Warhammer Community as the website in the 40k download section. The most relevant ones to Drukhari are the Faction Pack, which has the rules for that Reaper's Wager detachment, the errata document for the Codex, and that's where you have the Allied Harlequin rules, the Legends datasheets, and then the current points cost for the army are found in the Murator and Field manual, and the balance data slate might make a few changes to the faction if rules changes crop up in the future. It can be quite a lot of rules to pass together, and as mentioned earlier, certain third-party sites do host rules as well and try and keep them updated. Warpedia does quite a good job of that. For fielding the army in-game, as mentioned, they tend to move fast, hit hard and use a lot of transports. Their core mechanic is power from pain, where as well as command points you also have a system of pain tokens to manage. You gain one at the start of your command phase, one each time an enemy unit is destroyed, and one each time they fail Battle Shock, and some units can trigger Battle Shock and things. Previously you just plugged them into damage buffs for the army, but now each unit has its own pain ability. These ones are all listed on an extra special rule for their datasheets, and it does mean that all the Drukhari units are a bit more wordy than most ones from most factions, and you can get things like Cavalite Warriors rerolling all wound rolls against things on an objective, the Archon allowing reroll all hit rolls, the Talos getting fight on death, or Mandrakes using it to return to reserve. When playing games you'll likely get a feel of the higher reward for things for that. Sometimes direct damage increases could be the best use for the resource, sometimes some movement shenanigans. Then you'll have the choice of the different detachments. I talked through the names and themes of them briefly earlier. Currently it's the Reaper's Wager that seems to be having most success on the tournament scene. A few people using either the Kabbalite Cartel with its fun contract rule and the Spectacle of Spite for some stimmed up witches. Both of those are fun, but are going to push you to get really quite a lot of just the individual either Kabbalite or witch cult models, and might be a bit less likely to be reflective of a typical player's collection. If it were me and you were just starting out, I probably would go with the Reaper's Wager and the rules for that as a starting point. You get to reroll ones to hit basically all the time. If a Harlequins unit slays something, then your Drukhari units can then go back up to reroll all hits for a bit, but then the stratagems are quite nice just for getting to melee and hitting hard when they get there. There's an advance and charge one to prevent overwatch, which is quite a big deal, a reactive move for infantry, and then either lethal or sustained hits and fight on death when you're in combat. All of those are pretty great, and the enhancements are quite nice, perhaps particularly Arc Raider for scouting in a vehicle. The Deep Strike one could be fun for deploying some Kabbalite warrior firepower, and Conductor of Torment can be an interesting one to get you a few more rerolls, maybe on a safe character. Here's just one example of a starter army list. For this one I thought we'd go for a bit more of a practical one, so using the Realspace Raider Battle Force box set, plus the Combat Patrol box set, using all the models from that and expanding from there. Leading the way here we have Lady Malice and Archon, Lilith Hesperax and Homunculus. Malice and the Archon will both go with small squads of Incubi here, and Lilith Hesperax with the Witches for a hard-hitting unit. The Archon perhaps with some racks to do a bit of regenerating and being a nuisance model. We've then got a fair amount of elite infantry to be zooming forward in Raiders and Venoms. There's 3 Venoms and 1 Raider here. The Incubi will have pride of place, the Kabbalite Warriors will get split with a Venom, and the Witches can use the Raider to stage out of, giving a big boost to their charge threat range. The racks might be able to do a bit of transport shenanigans after things hop out, or otherwise just march up to the mid-board objectives. They'll be supported moving up there by some Talos Pain engines and a Kronos Parasite engine to farm some Pain tokens. For some damage dealers, we've got 2 sets of 5 Scourges, one with Dark Lances and one with Haywire, or at least being fielded that way. Some small squads of mounted units, a small squad of Hellions, and then 2 sets of 3 Reavers with Heat Lances to throw into the midst of the enemy and maybe cause disruption. And some screening and shadowy skirmishers with 2 sets of 5 Mandrakes. Between all that, that's really quite a varied list and quite a lot for the opponent to deal with. It should be a list that's pretty strong on the secondary game with quite so many small units rushing around and still having a few big damage punches that can really take down tough stuff. My main aim would more be to build up to an 1,000 point list first though, and then gradually build towards a 2,000 point list after you're getting games in. That's about it for this one though. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and feel free to check out that Drukhari tier list video that will be linked in the video description. I look forward to hearing any thoughts and advice from current Drukhari generals down in the comments. That's about it for this one. Before I go though, I'll just cycle back to the video sponsor, Futureproof Modular Terrain, and their rather fancy plastic pre-coloured terrain sets. For pros and cons of these versus other terrain sets, I think they do check really quite a lot of boxes. Being sculpted plastic components that actually have a bit of 3D detail to them, I think is an advantage over the MDF things. It's really quite fun to have the pre-coloured options here, and a few different colour schemes to choose from. And the modular feature, being able to disassemble it and store it, is really quite a nice one, and potentially reconfigure into different buildings if you'd like to. Not too bad in my opinion for terrain that's really quite functional for playing Warhammer 40K. That's for criticisms and downsides. It is a bit pricier than certain MDF terrain pieces out there, or certain 3D printed simpler plastic offerings, and a bit more so if going for the painted choices. I would also say that the construction of it, and whether or not you take it down, could require a bit of planning and forethought. They do go together relatively intuitively, but depending on builds you might be left with bits left over, or not quite enough bits to disguise the top sets of ruins. It does take a bit of time to get them set up and taken down, so I wouldn't want to reconfigure them too often personally. In any case though, basically the idea is that you build ruins from these plastic components plus the expansion bits for their roofs. Their main offering is this full table set at $240 or $300 painted, so around about £240 or €290 if you're using the link in the video description. They do have some other offerings as well, such as the half table set, and they've got really quite a vast amount of different colour offerings. As mentioned, I do quite like their World War one with the sandbags. Their Lost World one I think has got some quite good colours going over there, trying to convey it being all overgrown. And they've got some other ones such as the trippy sort of Cursed World one and a rather shadowy Forgotten World. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring this one. You can check them out linked down in the video description if you'd like to. I'll leave that there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you've been enjoying the videos on the channel, Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. Again, you can find that linked below if you'd like to. Channel patrons get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.